Hello, I want to tell you something about British drugs policy and about addiction and overdoses. So last year in Scotland there were 722 drug overdoses, 4,500 in Britain, 93,000 in the United States. This isn't good. I know something about it because I went through a drug treatment and testing order. I finished it. I'm almost clean. I'm still taking these things. I'll take one 2 ml tablet, nowhere near a therapeutic dose, and I'll shortly just cut the tablet in half and then cut it in a quarter, and then I'll not take anything. And I get this through a prescription, through a thing called Renfrewshire Drug Service, which is the local authority, the health board and the social work. There's nurses, there's doctors there, and there's drug workers who are social workers. And when you're told by a judge to get one of these treatments, you do it, or else you go to jail. Before I was on the DTTO, I had sought out drug treatment and I never got it. I waited 10 months and then by then I'd get caught shoplifting and I get sentenced to the DTTO, and I got my treatment that way rather than a self-referral. Waiting 10 months for drug treatment is terrible, and it's got a lot worse since the pandemic. The drug service has basically been cancelled. The people at the Renfrewshire Drug Service don't even know I've stopped going to the chemist because I've had one phone call in the last year and a half. That's obviously terrible. So how did we get here? Well, it's a bit of a horror story. There's actually a good book that was written about this by Joanne Harry, called Chasing the Scream, which is about the drug war. Because you might not realise this, but there's this huge link between American policy, not just drug policy, but geopolitics as well, and our drug policy. You might think they two cannot be linked. No, but they are. They absolutely are. Geopolitics and our drug policy. So how is that? Well, in the 1920s through to the early 1960s, Britain had a medicalised drug policy. It was famed throughout the world, whereas did I just say America? I meant to say Britain. Britain had a medicalised drug policy throughout the world, whereas in America they had the drug war. And it was led by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and one guy who led this bureau called Harry Anslinger, he's the kind of villain in Joanne Harry's book, and he is a kind of villain. He went on to head some kind of task force, this is decades later, that had something to do with the United Nations. I'll get to that in a minute. Throughout the 20s, the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, whilst America had this drug war and the Harry Anslingers of the world were harassing people and jailing people, there's a horrendous story about Billie Holiday, which Joanne Harry goes into. Britain had a medicalised approach, and with very stable rates of people who were taking drugs. Usually the situation would be somebody get prescribed morphine for pain and then just keep taking it and they end up addicted. That would be the usual situation. So what happened was in the late 1950s in Britain, you had all these moral panics. The late 50s and the early 60s, and the newspaper stories would be coming out with things to do with jazz musicians. They were the big problem. And the kind of underlying idea is that black people were coming to sleep with white women, and they would talk about these essentially sluts and these cafes and how black jazz musicians were coming to get them. This is in the UK newspapers. It's in the late 50s, early 60s. So in the mid 1960s, there used to be a committee called the Rolleston Committee. Sir Humphrey Rolleston headed it. Then there was a different committee, I can't remember when, I think it was the early 60s. The same kind of situation, but a different guy heading it. So his name was Russell Brain, and he came out with two reports in the mid 1960s. And they two reports were increasingly alarmist. And what they led to was the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. So you might think this was all a British idea. It really wasn't. In fact, it was an American idea. And the British policy was to satisfy a United Nations protocol, very similar to the climate change protocols, and the way that the IPCC and the COPs that we've just had are all structured. There's a similar thing for drugs. There's an advisory council, and that was one in Britain as well. But there's a United Nations one, which is really an American thing, because America puts pressure on the UN to continue the drug war, and the UN puts pressure on all sorts of other countries, including Britain. But there is a reason why it was adopted in the late 60s, so that it led to the Act in 1971, because Britain went for decades and decades and decades resisting this drug war. So why is it that we suddenly adopted it in 1971? And has anything changed since then? Well, I'll tell you a wee bit about the changes first. Since 1971, there's been quite a bit of change. Starting off in the 80s, we had a thing called harm reduction. That was introduced, obviously, in response to the AIDS crisis, other bloodborne viruses like Hep. So what the government did was to allow needle exchanges and treatments. The treatments were actually pioneered in America. There's one research couple, Dole and Niswander, and I'll get back to what they said about how you should do methadone prescription. And so governments in Britain started prescribing methadone, and later on the thing that I take, buprenorphine. Later on, they also introduced different legislation to amend the Misuse of Drugs Act to take care of these, I don't know what you call them, legal highs and whatnot. So people, without new laws, people could just make up chemicals and sell them and carry on their bath salts or whatever. So there was laws to take care of that, and just a general approach, more treatment orders. So in the 1990s, when Tony Blair's government came in, they massively expanded the criminal justice system, and a lot of orders were issued by judges, antisocial behaviour orders, that kind of thing. Included in that is drug treatment, and you ended up with DTTOs, drug treatment and testing orders. So these things have been expanded massively, because at the same time, what you had throughout the 80s and especially the 90s is this huge expansion of the criminal justice system. More and more people getting jailed. When I used to be in the jail in the 1990s, 7,000 prisoners. When I looked about 5 years ago, 10,000. That was in Scotland. So a massive expansion of the jail population, what people call mass incarceration. Doesn't just happen in America, it happens in Britain as well. And we've sort of half reversed course. In reality, it's plateaued, the amount of people in jail. But what has happened as well is this massive expansion of these orders. And the orders themselves have changed. So there's now a sort of push for abstinence to get people off of heroin, and as well as education. So you've got sort of four strands to British drug policy. You've got what they call limit and supply. That was the language of the 1971 Act. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also education, harm reduction, and these orders as well. So that's the kind of four strands to it. But it's very strange how, and the service has basically collapsed. So if you're wondering why there's 700 odd drug deaths, it's because there's no service there. And I'll speak at the end about one of the things they could do to really improve it. But you might ask, so what's this business with America? Why is Britain doing America's bidding? And why did it happen in the late 1960s? Well, it might be just me being cynical, but if you think about what was going on in the late 1960s, in the 40s, Britain had developed radar. America wanted it. Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, said, you give us that radar stuff, we'll give you nuclear secrets. Okay, Britain said, and then he died, rudely, without permission. Roosevelt died, and so the next president, Truman, said that they nearly had the bomb then. They said, nah, you're not getting the nuclear secrets. Britain developed its own nuclear weapons program. This is in the 50s. In the late 50s and early 60s, Britain was humiliated because it was a fading power. It tried a couple of dodgy things. It had overthrown some people, like in 1953, I think it was, the Iranian president, Mahmoud Mossadegh, but they tried to steal the Suez Canal, I think this is 1957, and failed, and America didn't help them. So it was clear Britain was a fading power. And so what America said this the late 50s, said, I'll tell you what, you stop developing your nuclear weapons and we'll lease you the technology to make your own nukes. And that's what Polaris was. So this is the early 60s now. Britain gets Polaris, but it's not Britain's. Neither's a Trident system right now. Britain leases the technology for the United States. They build the weapons here. They store them in Scotland. So it's really an American technology for what I think it was George Kennan, or one of these post-war planners, called the Great Aircraft Carrier in the Atlantic, meaning Britain. So it's really a way for America to control Britain. And it's a funny coincidence how this whole drug policy sort of reorientates itself towards this Americanized policy run about the same time. Is that not interesting? Well, I think it is. Anyway, so that's drug policy and how it's linked to geopolitics. But there is things that can be done to improve the service. I know part of the reason it's kind of crap right now is because of the pandemic. But there is things that can be done. When the guys who originally did the research for methadone maintenance, I said their names before, Dole and Icewander, they said, think of this like insulin and diabetes. People obviously take their diabetes every day, but it's a long-term thing. The average drug habit lasts 15 years. So this is an investment. You need to give these people in the treatment something to do, and that's not part of it. So you're not given anything to do, you're not given a job or anything like that. In fact, the truth is, if you've got a criminal record and you've went through a DTTO, you're pretty much banned from working. And I mean banned for anywhere. Can't get cleaning jobs or anything like that. Can't work in an airport, can't work in a hospital, can't work for the local council. And you dare not even apply because it's fraud if you lie. So people like me are pretty much up shit creek basically. But it doesn't have to be like that. The DTTOs could have within them a requirement to work. You have orders like that already, and there's actually loads of systems set up so that people can go out and do unpaid work. Well, you can also get paid work as well, or you can make the unpaid work towards something, towards a qualification or something like that. This can easily be done. You can make it a part of the DTTO so that the actual people who run the DTTO have to get you some kind of employment. We used to have something called the work programme. You could use those same kind of agencies. I can't remember what they were called, but there's loads and loads of them. They call them providers. That's what they're called. You could use those people to get people that we work. There's also a problem with the massive expansion of this whole PVG thing. It's expanded to all sorts of things. I know you have to protect people. That legislation came in the wake of the Soham murders, which is fair enough. But really, are junkies really that bad that they can't clean or pick up litter or something like that? It's a bit crazy. So that can be looked at as well. But you can definitely make work a part of the treatment, or at the very least give people somewhere to go. Because if you don't have anywhere to go, if you don't have a reason to get up in the morning, then there really isn't a point to this drug treatment at all. I mean, I'm different. I did the treatment properly. As you can see, I've still got missing teeth and I need to get them fixed. But I was told by the people that work there that I'm pretty much the only person they've seen who actually did it properly, who actually gave them negative samples all the time. and actually was drug free. They said very, very, very few people like that. Well, that means that's not working. So I think there's a lot of things can be done. There's a lot about the drug treatments is a bit of a joke. The testing's a bit of a joke for a start. I remember one time it came back positive for me taking Valium. I've never taken Valium. Like crazy. Anyway, nuts. The testing doesn't really work, I don't think. And I know loads of people that were able to get by the testing by putting bits of bleach tablets in their mouth and all that kind of stuff. You don't get pee samples anywhere, you pack a spongy thing, this plasticky spongy thing in your mouth. And that's how you get your test. But I don't think they work that well, because I know lots of people that were able to get by the tests. Anyway, I think there's a lot can be done with the drug treatment and testing orders. It's often said that we should have a citizen's income or universal basic income. Something like that would be a massive benefit to folk like myself, folk that's coming off a treatment. But mostly what we need is a way of getting back into society, a way of getting back into work, because there's nothing like that right now. We're effectively banned from working. It's a bit crazy. Anyway, I just thought I'd tell you that.